Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to ASPI Parsha class. I'm Sofia, the ASPI intern. I am excited to begin our next book of Torah with you today. We have gone through a whole book so far of the Torah, all of Sefer Bereshit, using our fun method of comparing the Parsha to an interesting Talmudic passage and seeing what we can gain from it. And now we're going to see how far we can continue with this process. Today we're going to be starting Sefer Shemot. There's lots to be discussed in this section. The beginning of Moshe being a leader and the burning bush. I want to talk in particular today about Moshe and about a very pivotal moment in his leadership. And I'm hoping that we can have some interesting discussion about what's going on and then hopefully see what the Gemara shares for us about this experience. So as usual, I'm going to get the source sheet and gonna paste it in the chat. And then I'll share my screen as well. Okay. So share screen. Amazing. Okay. So we're going to be starting in the second chapter. The first chapter of Shemot was a lot of discussion about the midwives, these midwives of the Israelites were in charge of, in theory, killing all the baby boys because there was an understanding that there was too much overpopulation happening in Egypt by the Israelites. The midwives were God-fearing. They didn't want to do that. And luckily, Moshe, the little baby Moshe, was saved thanks to his mother, hiding him and then sending him off into the basket in the river. The daughter of Pharaoh finds him, adopts him, and he is raised in the Egyptian palace. This might be, for those of you who might be familiar with the movie Prince of Egypt, the idea of him basically being the prince and wearing all of the royal garb is a big part of that movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend to create articulation of this amazing narrative. And I want to talk today about the first time that Moshe realizes that there's something wrong with the entire system that he is a part of and the suffering that it is causing. And I'm excited for us to read that. And already as a heads up for the Tanakh piece, I'm excited to hear what you think about what Moshe did. All right, so let's start here. I'm going to read in the Hebrew and explain. Chapter 2, verse 11. ויהי בימים ההם, ויגדל משה ויצא אל אחיו, וירא בסבלותם, וירא איש מצרי מכה איש עברי מאחיו. So in those days, Moshe grew up. He was originally a little baby in the basket. Now he's grown up. And he goes to his brethren, which is interesting, right? Like, we're a little bit unclear if Moshe understands where he's from and who he is related to, but the narration here seems to suggest otherwise. And then it says that he sees or witnesses their suffering. It's a great articulation by Yar B'Sivotam that he saw inside of their suffering. It's like a very intense way of saying it. For those of you who will be in Chicago this weekend, I hope to be talking about that in my drasha this week. What does it exactly mean to see into someone's suffering? But that'll be a spoiler alert, I guess, for what's to come. And then what does Moshe see? He sees that there is an Egyptian man who is hitting a Hebrew slave, one of his brethren. So Moshe looks around here and there, sees that no one is looking, and he hits the Egyptian, and then through this hit actually kills him, and then he buries him in the sand. Next verse. The next day, the second day, Moshe then sees two Hebrew slaves fighting with each other, and he says to the bad one, seemingly the one who's doing the hitting in this fighting of the other slave, "Why have you hit your fellow? Why would you be doing that?" But then this the hitting slave says to Moshe, "Vayomer mi samcha leish sar v'shofet aleinu." Hal hargeni ata omer kasher haragta et hamitzri, vayira Moshe vayomar achenu noda hadavar. And so this bad hitting slave says, "Who put you in charge to be the one to decide, right? That what is good and bad? Are you going to kill me just like you killed that Egyptian?" And by him kind of taunting him that way, by the slave taunting Moshe that way, Moshe realizes that people saw what he did, and he gets scared. He goes, "Oh no, people know, even though I buried the Egyptian in the sand, that something bad happened, that I had killed him. וישמע פרעה את הדבר הזה, ובקש להרוג את משה, ויברח משה מלפני פרעה, וישב ארץ מדיין, וישב על הבאר. Pharaoh then heard the bad thing that Moshe did by killing the Egyptian, and then wanted to kill Moshe. And then Moshe runs away from Pharaoh and heads to the land of Midian and sits on a well. And then eventually, what picks up from this story is that he befriends the Midianites, he marries into the family, and he's distant from the Egyptians. Eventually, though, he'll have the call to return with the burning bush, and then he'll come back. But this is the story that we have so far. Moshe is in the palace, being a prince, and he starts seeing the suffering of the Israelite slaves around him. So much so that he sees one Israelite slave getting hit by an Egyptian taskmaster, and he's so pained by it that he feels like he needs to kind of retaliate back to the Egyptian and hits him and then kills him. And then it all kind of spirals from there. So I'm curious, this is a narrative, I guess, that's like pretty common. It's not like common within, well, not common, but it's a narrative that most of us are familiar with within the Jewish tradition. And I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts about what exactly they think is going on here. Is this not good that Moshe acted this way? Do you think that he maybe understood the implications of what he was doing? I'm curious if people have any thoughts about that they'd like to share. Well, I can share my thoughts for now, and if anyone has any, they're welcome to jump in. I think what is very interesting here is a few things. One, it doesn't say that Moshe was looking to kill the Egyptian, right? It says that he was he was looking to hit the Egyptian, in theory, to, I guess, stop him from hurting the Hebrew slave. And it seems like maybe kind of like, it doesn't say explicitly that he had the intention to kill. So it seems like maybe Moshe really didn't mean for the Egyptian to be killed, and he doesn't realize like what exactly he has just done and how it's kind of gone wrong. I think that that's very interesting. And then I think we can also ask, like, well, why did he think hitting as a response to an Egyptian hitting a Hebrew slave was really like the right way to do it? Maybe they could have sat down, had a discussion. No need to get some violence involved. Maybe that's naive on my end about like how conflict resolution and that time period could work. I think that's interesting. And I think also that this interaction of watching the Hebrew slaves and like all of a sudden Moshe trying to get involved in their business is fascinating. And then also how they respond is deeply painful. But I guess the question that I'm curious about is what the Mitzri, the Egyptian taskmaster obviously was wrong in causing any kind of suffering. We don't like when suffering happens to other people. But I think what's interesting is trying to figure out what exactly was so upsetting to Moshe. Maybe it's just being an empathetic person, seeing someone suffering, you want to step in. But I think that there's some question marks about what exactly is going on there that the Gemara is going to be filling in for us that we look at. So I hope we can go to that and see some more insight. Does anyone, just as a last chance before we move on to the next topic, have anything they want to share about that? Yes. Hi, Audrey.
Hi. Where it says that he went out among his kinsfolk, are we supposed to understand that Moshe knew these were his kinsfolk? I was just thinking about all the social hierarchies in this context, and that Moshe lived in the palace and he had to leave the palace to go see his kinsfolk. So, I mean, to respond to what you're asking, was he identifying with his kinsfolk? But also, was he used to being in a superior place in the social hierarchy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that there's different understandings of how much he knew. To me, I feel like it's odd regardless whether he knows that they're his kinsfolk or not. Like just the image of him like being part of the royal family, all of a sudden like going to help his brethren who are slaves, just feels like a very strange image to me. But that is like an understanding that's out there in the Midrash. Hopefully what I'll talk more about actually the Shabbat. But yeah, I think it's unclear. I think it can be read either way. And I agree with you. It's quite uncomfortable. And I think usually we read the interaction between the two Hebrew slaves almost like a kind of sassiness of like, who are you to say that like you're supposed to get involved in our affairs? But I think when you point out this idea of the different social hierarchies, like it's very uncomfortable. It's like, I don't get it. Like you're in charge of us, but also like we're kind of doing our own thing. Why are you getting involved? Are you even one of us? Like there is a lot of identity and power structures, I think that are at play here that add a lot of different layers. So I think that's a great thing to point out. Anyone else want to share anything before we move on? Okay. All right, let's go to the Gemara. So the Gemara choice that I have here is, I think, a very interesting one. It kind of opens up a huge can of worms that I'm excited to open up with you today. I'm excited to get on with that here. So we're going to be looking at Masechet Sanhedrin. I think we've looked at it here as a group before. It is a tractate all about how the courts should work. But also there's a lot of discussion about, in light of this, like who exactly the courts are addressing. And so at some point in Masechet Sanhedrin, there's discussion of non-Jews and about if non-Jews have any kind of relationship to Jewish court. And in that becomes the discussion of the 7 Noahide laws, which we'll discuss what exactly those are as we go along. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Oved Kochavim shehika et Yisrael chayav mitah, shene'emar, vayifen chovacho, vayar ki ein ish vayachet hamitzri v'gomer. So when they're listing these rules that non-Jews need to abide by, even though they aren't following the Torah, one of them is that anyone, a non-Jew that kills a Jew is now is liable for death penalty. And the source that they give is this exact verse that we saw, that Moshe looked around and then killed the Mitzri, the Egyptian. So they seem to be understanding the story that we just read in Shemot as not just Moshe feeling a sense of strong empathy for his brethren, for the Israelite slaves, but actually sees it as an execution of the judicial process. Moshe wasn't looking around and being like, how do I make sure to protect my fellow Jew? He sees, oh my gosh, a non-Jew is trying to kill a Jew. I must intervene because that legally is not allowed. Which I think is, I mean, it feels, maybe you could say, slightly anachronistic. Like, did Moshe really know these rules? There's an understanding that there's Noahide law, meaning, and we'll actually look into this, that everyone who's from Noah, which is everyone in the world, because everyone else had drowned in the flood all the way back in the book of Genesis, that they have some set of rules that are different than ours. We have much more, but there's some understanding that there are rules dictated by God that they still need to care about. And that there's a lot to unpack there that we will. But in understanding that one of these things is that killing a Jewish person would be a problem. And it feels, though, to me that, like, it doesn't seem to me that was clear in part of Moshe's calculus. But I think that that's an interesting read nonetheless. Another interesting read I actually think is from Rashi. So this isn't, I know we focus on Gemara, but I think just adding the layers of like what was going on in Moshe's mind when he was doing this is a totally different understanding that's taken from the Midrash. So I'm going to throw that out here too. Makeh ishivri, malkehu v'rodehu, beating and flogging him. Uva'ala shel Shlomit bat ivri haya v'natan einav ba, uvalayla hamido v'hotzio mibeito, v'chazar v'nichnas lebayit, uva'al ishto kisvura shehu ba'ala, v'chazar yish lebeito v'hirgish badavar k'shera auto mitzri, shirgish badavar haya makeh v'rodehu kol hayom. Okay, so this is a very troubling story that we're about to translate. Okay, the latter, the Hebrew slave, was the husband of Shlomit, the daughter of Dibri, who is a character that appears later on in Vayikra in a totally different context. So this is about Shlomit's bat Dibri's son is in that context. So it's a weird thing that the verses would say not the name of the son, but say that he was the son of so-and-so and it's the mom. So I think that's why they feel like there's probably a bigger story there to be told. So they pick up on that. And the Egyptian tax master had set his fancy upon her. Great translation from Sofia, I guess. During the night, he compelled him, her husband, to rise and made him leave the house. So the Egyptian made the Hebrew slave leave Shlomit bat Dibri's house. He, however, returned and entered the house and forced his attentions upon the woman, she believing it was her husband. So he basically goes and pretends to be her husband and then seemingly in a kind of way rapes her because it's not clear that she understands who he is and did not have consent to be sleeping with him. The man returned and became aware of what had happened. And when the Egyptian perceived that he was aware of it, he beat him and flogged him the whole day long. So it seems here that what Rashi is providing, it's actually from Shemot Rabbah, from Midrash, is that it isn't just a normal Egyptian taskmaster and a typical Hebrew slave. It's that the Hebrew slave and the Egyptian taskmaster have not a relationship, but there's a past history where the Egyptian taskmaster already has been trying to seduce the Hebrew slave's wife, and has actually come into his house and taken his wife. And then the moment that the Hebrew slave finds out, he's very angry. So he takes out all of that on him. And this is what Moshe sees from the get-go. Interesting. I don't know how Moshe himself could have known that. But it seems here that maybe why they want to provide this context for us is just Moshe jumping into any taskmaster and any slave. I mean, he's seen that his entire life, right? He's been raised in the palace to just all of a sudden feel that he needs to step in when he sees a slave being hurt by the taskmaster. What could have changed it? This might be an insight that's not like a typical slave and taskmaster situation. And also, in a way, maybe it kind of trying to justify Moshe's actions, because even though we are happy for justice to be served, it is pretty violent and extreme for a leader that we are revering to actually kill someone. And maybe this is kind of making it feel a little bit better to say, actually, he wasn't such a great guy, this Egyptian taskmaster. There was a lot of bad things. It's very useful that he's out of the way. But I think this, and then also the Sanhedrin source in particular, are trying to assess what Moshe was doing. And I would like to suggest are trying to say that maybe what Moshe did on its own would feel kind of problematic. And it's helpful either to provide the context of this family, or to provide the context of actually there are these Noahide laws that Moshe was trying to execute that make his actions feel a little bit more comfortable for those of us who see Moshe as a role model, and especially a role model of leadership. So I think those are interesting layers. I want to explore more this idea of the Noahide laws that I was mentioning before. This is the bridge between that. This source I'll summarize quickly is another source of Sanhedrin, where we learn that it's an issue to strike your friend or to strike any person, to hit them. And the source that they have to derive for it is actually that the second Egyptian slave saying to Moshe, why did, when Moshe calls them out and says, why did you hit them? And it's just interesting that they also use this to derive. It seems like this story, in a lot of ways, is like a locus for a lot of larger rules about violence and how we relate to each other. So I put it in there because I thought it was interesting. But let's go back to the Noahide laws. So this is the verse that kind of starts this conversation. It's a weird thing because you'd think we have the 10 commandments, right? It's very easy for us to figure out the 10 commandments. You go to chapter 20 of the book of Exodus and you see 1, 2, 3. There's great discussions about where exactly do certain commandments stop and start. But overall, it's pretty easy to figure out. But to figure out what the 7 Noahide laws actually is much more complicated. So I'm going to show us a verse in the Torah that kind of starts us off, and then we'll see how the Gemara takes in. So in Breshit, all the way back to Parsha Noah that we had, all the way back at the beginning, right? The second Parsha that we did this with. After the flood, God sets a new set of rules because he says, okay, I don't want to destroy the world again. So let's make some rules, some ground rules for how this is going to work. And so what does God say? Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam. Great. That's a great alliteration. It's a tongue twister. Even more so. Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech ki b'tzelem Elohim asa et ha'adam. Whoever sheds human blood, by human hands shall that one's blood be shed, for the image of God was humankind made. So basically the idea is that this is a commandment that's given to all of Noah's descendants. So this is before Abraham, before chosen people. And the commandment is any person who spills blood, their blood too needs to be spilled, because we are created in the image of God. And so therefore spilling blood it's not just not kind, it's actually almost like a violation of the divine, which is a very powerful image. So there seems to be a tit for tat kind of understanding. If you spill blood, your blood's going to have to be spilled too. And then this is where it starts. And then now we're going to see how the Gemara then extrapolates 7 rules that all Noahide people should follow. And Noahide people, meaning here, any descendants of Noah, which in a post-flood world is all of us, including non-Jews. So here's the source in Sanhedrin again. Menahani Mile, how do we know where these 7 mitzvot of Noahides are derived? Amar Rabbi Yochanan de Amar Kra, Vayitzav Adonai Elohim al ha'adam limor mikol eitz hagan achol te'achel. Vayitzav elu hadinim v'chein hu omer v'chi yidativ l'man asher yitzaveh et banav v'gomer. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan says, we learned it from a verse, actually, all the way in the 2nd chapter of Breshit, when talking about what fruit can be eaten in the garden. And the Lord God commanded man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat. But what they're noticing is the Vayitzav Hashem, God commanded. So they're picking up on that, and they're saying, with regard to the term and God commanded, this is not referring to just eating the fruit, it's referring to creating courts of judgment, which is a funny read, but I guess they're seeing commandments, so they're thinking courts are how you implement judgment. Okay, so they're seeing that as a more expansive reading. And so it states in another verse, for I have known him to the end that he may command his children. There's another verse in also in Breshit that really is a stronger connection between Vayitzav of commanding and then the courts. Okay. All right, and now with the term Hashem, right, because Vayitzav Hashem, Zo Birkat Hashem. Another rule for Noahides is Birkat Hashem, which sounds like blessing of God, but actually, and this happens often in Gemara, really means cursing. When there's something bad that the Gemara is talking about, but doesn't really want to almost like bring like a bad luck charm to it, they say the opposite. So like when bad things happen about Israel, it usually says these Sonehem Shel Yisrael, the haters of Israel, are the ones that are going to have bad things happen to them. So here too, Birkat Hashem, blessing of God, actually means cursing God. And interestingly enough, even though Noahide people are not Jewish, they still are not allowed to curse in the name of God. Okay. Okay, so there we go. They gave us a verse about why you can't swear in God's name and how it's bad, so no cursing. Then they're taking again from that pasuk earlier about the fruit eating. It says Adonai Elohim, 2 names of God. Elohim, zo avodat kochavim, that even though if you're not Jewish, you cannot do idol worship. Okay, so because it says you can't worship other gods, Elohim is the connection. Al Ha'adam, again, we're saying about the commanding the fruit, but then we're commanding Adam. Zo shfichut damim, there you can't, this is teaching that you can't spill human blood, which was that line, right? That you can't spill human blood. That's another one. Lemor zogilui arayot. When God commanded to Adam to say, they're reading that as saying sexual immorality is not allowed for Noahides. Lemor hen yishalach ish et ishto. Okay, great. That's justifying why that. Mikol eitz hagan velo gezel. So you can't eat from any tree in the garden. It's teaching you don't steal. The last one is, and you can eat from these other ones, but it's telling you that it's coming to exclude that you can't eat any meat that is live, meaning that there needs to be some kind of like slaughtering process. You can't just like eat a raw animal live, like in mid-motion, I guess, because it seems kind of animalistic to do something like that. So this is a long way of saying that there's a lot of different rules for Noahides that they extrapolate actually originally from a verse in the beginning of the Garden of Eden. There's a lot of extra words seemingly, and so from each one, the rabbis learn a different rule. So we have courts, swearing in God's name, avodah zarah, killing other people, sexual impropriety, and then eating live raw animals. That's 6. I guess I'm missing one. Somewhere in there. Oh, there was 6. There's definitely, there's definitely 7. Did we say courts? Maybe I'm missing one. There are 7. And most importantly, also for ours, is that we're seeing that that killing another person is a problem. But I think this is just a fascinating phenomenon, like the idea that outside of the Jewish people, there are still expectations for what non-Jews should be doing in relationship to God. And I'm curious, maybe for some people, they've heard about Noahide law before. Maybe it's their first time. I'm curious if anyone has anything to say about it, if this is what kind of image of what Judaism is, or what it should look like as a religion that is seemingly particular, but has expectations that are not so particular. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts or insights or questions they want to share about that.
So I'm sorry, this is Audrey again.
Hi, yeah.
But what I've been thinking about is mitigation, because that seems to be what Rashi's giving us background story as mitigation, but also about laws and degrees. And if we're to understand that there's this overarching Noahide law that you shouldn't kill another person, are we supposed to understand that what Moshe was doing was reading intent, that perhaps you are allowed to hit a slave, but not beat the slave all day, that beating the slave all day communicated an intent to kill? I don't know. That's what I was thinking. Like, is there, I don't really understand what the context of their slavery was, but hitting someone all day long sounds a little extreme. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think there definitely, this read of seeing him as executing Noahide law is definitely a read into it of like, I guess that's like similar to what I was saying before, like why was this the one that he jumped in? If he was just upset at seeing Hebrew slaves being treated wrongly, like this should have happened a long time ago. Why is this
right? Like you had said, like was there a right way to hit your slave? And this person was obviously going beyond the usual method of hitting one slave. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I hadn't noticed that detail about the hitting all day. I think that's a good point of like, that seems to be suggesting that this was going too far. I mean, again, why would any hitting be okay? But there might be more of a concern for safety and for life than usual.
Well,
I think
also like what bothered me was that it's apparently okay to hit slaves and hit other people, but as soon as Moshe had killed another person, it's communicated to us through the text that then Pharaoh was upset about it. So would Pharaoh have been upset if there was a report that Moshe hit anyone at all, but that within this context that he hit someone else but did not actually kill them? So I don't know.
Yeah, right. I would assume that a pharaoh would be like so tyrannical that probably even would be upset, even hearing anyone kind of like fight back. Maybe would be upsetting. But yeah, we could also say like why is the killing the thing that is so problematic to Pharaoh? Probably the Pharaoh wouldn't be so into Moshe doing anything to seemingly like defy his authority. But it is interesting that like that's really what does it. Also, like that Pharaoh himself, I mean, if in theory Moshe is adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh, you'd think they could have had like a nice chat of like, why'd you do that? And instead, Pharaoh sees it as such a strong, I guess, challenge to his authority that he really wants to kill Moshe, that he has to run away. That doesn't sound like the healthiest of family dynamics, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else have anything they want to share? Okay. What I'm curious to kind of end us off with is the idea of these Noahide laws. I think this question of like, why did Moshe act the way that he did? Was he so upset by the injustice he was seeing? If that was really the issue, why is killing the response? Is all a good one. But I think that what this new layer that the Gemara gives us, the opportunity to talk about Noahide law, is an opportunity to be thinking about our relationship to people outside the Jewish community, and how we view them. And I wanted to kind of think about that together with this Rashi that is on the first verse of Breshit, I think that Rashi asks a very interesting question. And then I think that it can relate a little bit to kind of this discussion about Noahide law. So on the first word of the entire Torah, Breshit, Rashi says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Lo hayat tzarich lahatchil et Torah, ela mechodesh hazeh lachem. Shehi mitzvah rishona shnitztavu ba'Yisrael, umahatam patach b'Breshit. So Rashi is quoting this Rabbi Yitzchak, and he says, the Torah could have started actually from the very first law, which is HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, his idea of calling the new month. It's all the way in Exodus chapter 12. If the Torah is a law book, we would think that it should start there. Right? That's the first mitzvah. So what is the reason to start at Breshit? Now, I think that's a great question. Why are we starting the beginning of the Jewish people here, as opposed to when the first set of rules are given to us? Are we not a group of people that follow the rules that are given to us by God? The answer that Rashi gives, I don't particularly like. I find it's kind of weak. He kind of gives a defensive answer where he says, we need to show that God wanted us in the land all the way at its conception, because in the future, there are going to be groups that are going to question our validity in the land, and we need to show that we are not thieves, which is interesting. People could read in a lot of 21st century politics, I guess, about Israel into that if they'd like. But I think that here the question is better than the answer. And I think the question asks us, like, why are we starting the story of the Jewish people actually before the Jewish people exist, right? The Jewish people, we could say, maybe they start at Abraham, well, kind of, because there's a lot of nations will come out of Abraham, but the idea of chosen people starts, or like people who start following God is from there. We could have started all the way at the Ten Commandments and standing at Mount Sinai, because that is our moment where we as Jews became a nation. But instead we start here. And I think that Judaism is a particularistic religion in some ways, but also has a really beautiful strand of universalism, where the beginning of the Jewish story actually doesn't start with the Jews, but it starts with the creation of all people. And it starts with God being the God of everyone. And I think that that's a difficult idea, I guess, for us also, like in a world where there's like sometimes more of an evangelical push, that if we believe one way, that like everyone has to believe like us. But built into the system of the Torah from the get-go is an idea that there are some people who believe in the way that Jews do, and there's always a group of people that do not. And it doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all for them. There's an understanding that they have some kind of rules, but they don't have to convert into what we're doing. I have a cousin actually who I just saw when I was in Israel a few weeks ago, and he is a rabbi that talks to Noahide people, which I think is a very fascinating idea and phenomenon. I kind of was asking him, like, how do they find you? Don't they want to convert? Like, if they're talking to you and asking you halachic questions? And he goes, no, they're like very fine with being Noahide. It's pretty easy to follow. So like these rules, not into killing, wanting to have judicial courts, not swearing in the name of God. They can believe in God without worshiping God in the same way we do, I guess. Not so difficult. And yet there still, it seems to be a desire to be like connected to God in this way, but not having to be Jewish. And I found that very both confusing and inspiring, because I think that it's beautiful that it's built into our framework, that we don't have to have everyone be like us and be like Jews. Even in a messianic world, the goal isn't for all of us to be Jewish at the end. There's an idea that we can all kind of coexist in a way and find different shared common ground. And I think that this story is like a funny reminder, because we're bringing up Noahide law, and that just because someone isn't Jewish doesn't mean that we don't hold them up to certain moral standards. At the same time, we're not looking to convert everyone as we are. And it's a funny, I guess, springboard for that conversation. That I when I was looking, I was like surprised to find. I was like, I would never have expected Parsha to be the beginning of us as the Jewish people to actually be a time to be talking about Noahide law. But I thought it was an interesting connection, and hopefully people found it interesting here this evening. If anyone has any more thoughts or questions they want to share about it, they're welcome to ask.
Could you explain more about the Noahides? Are they like is it the Chaldeans? Like there's actually groups of Chaldean immigrants in Detroit who are still like, well, okay, don't quote me on it, but no, do quote me on this. Like there's a group of people that traces themselves all the way back to like ancient times. But who are the Noahides? Are they similarly a group of people who may or may not be a small population, but are able to really trace themselves back? Or what does it mean exactly?
Well, first of all,
Today, for your
the I've never heard of this about the Chaldeans, so that's fascinating, and I'd love to more about
oh,
that.
okay.
The Noahides aren't actually connected to like a previous tribe or anything like that. It's just being not Jewish but wanting to follow these easy 7 rules. That's it. That's like all the qualifications that are necessary. I think that from what I understood from speaking to my cousin, it's like there's quite a few Christians who read the Old Testament and they go, well, like it's not a totally expired testament. Like there's still what to be valued there. So I think that like sometimes they want to follow what they find in the Old Testament there and feel a connection to it, even if they also are very Christian. So I think that there was a large group that way, but otherwise, I don't know for sure. This is like from speaking to him, it didn't seem like the population was of a specific ethnic descent or anything like that. It was just about like if they identify as such. But then it becomes like a great question of like, do like Noahides raise their kids as Noahides? Is it like something that
right.
Noahide plus other stuff? Like I don't actually know what the culture is, but there was enough of a group that they like found this my cousin who's a rabbi and talked to him about it, and he spoke to the Pope actually about them. Like the Pope is aware that they exist. That seems like a fun wormhole that maybe we can go down after after the class on the internet to kind of figure out where these Noahides are. But they're among us. They're here somewhere.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, last chance for anyone to share, and otherwise we'll wrap up. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. Yeah, it's a study tour on a Wednesday evening. I appreciate that, and hopefully see some of you next week where we go to Parsha Va'era, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.